10 years ago, when I was 17, my family lived in an old house in the countryside. Our house was located on a remote rural road, surrounded by dense woods, and the nearest neighbors were several miles away. Despite being somewhat isolated from the outside world, I always felt safe in such an environment because there weren't many people around to disturb us. That night, I was home alone. My parents had taken my younger sister to the city for a party and wouldn't be back until very late. I was looking forward to a quiet night by myself. I sat in the living room watching TV, enjoying the rare solitude. The night outside was gradually deepening, and the house was so quiet that the only sounds were the TV and the occasional flipping of pages from my book. Around midnight, I decided to make myself a cup of tea in the kitchen. As I walked into the kitchen, I suddenly heard a strange sound outside, like light footsteps. I stood by the window, peering out through the gap in the curtains, but saw nothing. I told myself it was probably just an animal moving around outside, and continued making my tea. A few minutes later, I returned to the living room with my hot tea and had just sat down when the power suddenly went out. The entire house was plunged into darkness, with only the faint moonlight from outside illuminating the room. I felt a wave of unease but tried to stay calm. I fumbled around for a flashlight and turned it on, the beam cutting through the darkness. I decided to check the circuit breaker to see what had caused the power outage. The entrance to the basement, where the breaker was located, was next to the kitchen, behind a heavy wooden door. Opening the door, I was hit by a musty smell of dampness. I took a deep breath and ascended the steep wooden stairs. The basement was dark and damp, with moss growing on the walls, and the air was filled with an unpleasant odor. I shone the flashlight around, cautiously making my way to the breaker. Suddenly, I heard a faint dripping sound, which seemed unusually loud in the silent basement. I looked around, trying to locate the source of the sound, but found nothing. As I approached the breaker, the flashlight's beam began to dim and eventually went out. I stood in the darkness, my heart pounding, the shadows around me seeming to close in. I forced myself to stay calm, felt my way to the breaker, and flipped the switch. The house instantly lit up again, and I breathed a sigh of relief. But when I turned to leave, I noticed something moving in the corner of the basement. I squinted and saw a vague silhouette standing in the darkness, staring at me. I was so frightened I almost screamed, but quickly covered my mouth, forcing myself to remain calm. I slowly backed away, trying not to alert the figure. Back on the ground floor, I quickly locked the basement door, my heart racing. Who was that figure? How did he get in? My mind was filled with questions and fear. I decided not to investigate further alone and tried to contact my parents. However, when I picked up the phone, I discovered that the line had been cut. A chill ran down my spine. I couldn't believe this was happening. I could only hope my parents would return soon. For the next few hours, I stayed in the living room, tense and alert to every sound. The night grew deeper and sleepiness began to creep in, but I forced myself to stay awake. Just when I was about to succumb to exhaustion, I suddenly heard faint footsteps upstairs. Fear gripped me again as I tightly held the flashlight and slowly walked up the stairs. The hallway upstairs was pitch dark, lit only by my flashlight. I took each step cautiously, following the sound to my bedroom. I pushed open the bedroom door and found the window open, the night wind rustling the curtains. My heart raced as I approached the window to check if it was broken, but it seemed someone had intentionally opened it. I looked around but found nothing unusual, yet the feeling of being watched grew stronger. I walked to my bed and suddenly felt something underfoot. Looking down, I saw an old photograph. The person in the photo looked very familiar to me as a child, and the background was this very house. I didn't remember having such a photo in the house, which puzzled me greatly. At that moment, I heard a low, eerie laugh behind me. I turned abruptly and saw a tall, dark figure standing at the door, a creepy smile on his face. I was so terrified I could barely move, watching as he slowly advanced toward me. Just then, I heard the sound of a car engine outside. My parents had returned. I dashed out of the room and ran down the stairs to meet them. Seeing my frightened state, they immediately sensed something was wrong. I told them what had happened, and my father grabbed his stick, ready to check the basement. However, when we reopened the basement door, we found it empty. The figure seemed never to have existed. My father searched the entire house and found no signs of intrusion, but my fear didn't dissipate. After that night, we installed more locks and security measures in the house, but the feeling of being watched never left me. A few months later, we moved out of the old house, but the eerie summer night remained a haunting memory. Years later, At a family gathering, I overheard a neighbor talking about the history of that house. They said a peculiar scientist once lived there, conducting various mysterious experiments in the basement until he died in an accident. Since then, the house had been rumored to be haunted, with many people experiencing strange occurrences. Although these were just rumors, my experience that night convinced me that the old house indeed harbored secrets unknown to us. Whoever that figure was and whatever his purpose, I had no desire to find out. The memory became a permanent shadow in my mind, reminding me never to underestimate the hidden secrets in seemingly peaceful old houses. In 2010, we lived in an old farmhouse in the countryside. Our house was situated on a remote rural road, surrounded by thick snow with the nearest neighbors miles away. Winter nights were short and cold, while the nights were long and silent. That evening it was snowing heavily outside, and the wind was howling. My mom and I were at home, while my dad and brother had gone to town for a farm gathering and would be back late. My mom and I were baking cookies in the kitchen, preparing for the upcoming Christmas. The warm fire and the aroma of cookies from the oven made the atmosphere cozy as we chatted and worked. Suddenly, there was an urgent knock on the door, breaking the tranquility of the house. The knocking was hurried, as if someone outside was anxiously waiting. My mom and I exchanged a glance, and she frowned, taking off her gloves and walking to the door. I felt a bit nervous, but thought it was just someone needing help in the heavy snow. My mom opened the door, and there stood a man dressed in a thick coat, with a hat and scarf covering most of his face, only revealing a pair of cold eyes. He looked disheveled, covered in snow, as if he had been walking outside for a long time. He told us that his car had broken down nearby, and he needed to use the phone to call a tow truck. My mom nodded and invited him in to warm up. After the man came in, we led him to the living room to sit by the fireplace. My mom handed him the phone, and he made a brief call, saying the tow truck would arrive in about an hour. My mom told him he could wait here until the tow truck arrived. The man sat by the fire while we returned to the kitchen, but I couldn't shake off a sense of unease. His appearance was too sudden, and he remained silent, his eyes filled with a coldness that made me uneasy. After a while, my mom sensed something was off too. She gestured for me to come aside, and we quietly discussed the situation, deciding to remain cautious and vigilant. Minutes ticked by, and the man still sat there, unmoving. Suddenly, I heard a strange sound outside, like someone walking in the snow. I went to the window and peeked through the curtains, seeing the figure slowly approaching the house. Fear gripped me, and I quickly informed my mom. My mom's face changed as she realized something was wrong. She quickly picked up the phone to call the police, but the phone line seemed to be cut. We exchanged a fearful glance, realizing we might be in some sort of trap. At that moment, the man in the living room suddenly stood up, a sinister smile spreading across his face. He looked at us and slowly walked closer, his eyes filled with danger. My mom and I backed away quickly, and she motioned for me to run upstairs. I nodded and dashed towards the stairs. I ran to my bedroom and locked the door. Through the window, I saw the two figures outside had reached the door and seemed to be trying to get in. I was terrified and didn't know what to do. Then, I heard a commotion downstairs. My mom was confronting the man. I decided I couldn't just hide and do nothing. I grabbed a baseball bat and held it tightly. The noise outside my door grew louder, as if someone was trying to break it down. Taking a deep breath, I walked to the door, ready to face whatever danger awaited. Suddenly, there was a loud crash as if someone had forcefully broken down the door. Footsteps approached, and my heart raced. I heard my mom arguing with the people outside. Gathering my courage, I opened the door and saw my mom facing three men, one of whom was the man who had come in earlier. They looked at me and sneered, not seeming to take me seriously as a threat. I raised the baseball bat, trying to protect my mom, but they were much stronger and easily pushed me to the ground. Desperation filled me, not knowing what to do next. At that moment, I heard the sound of a car engine outside, followed by hurried footsteps. My dad and brother had returned. Hope surged through me, knowing help had arrived. My dad burst into the house, holding a shotgun. Seeing the situation, he fired a warning shot into the air, startling the intruders. The three men, seeing the shotgun, turned pale. They hadn't expected us to be armed. They quickly retreated, trying to escape, but were surrounded by our returning neighbors and the police outside. They were eventually arrested, and we finally breathed a sigh of relief. Later, we learned that the three men were part of a roaming gang of thieves who took advantage of snowy nights to break into houses. They used the broken-down car as a ruse to gain trust, and then committed their crimes. Fortunately, We had called the police in time and received help from our neighbors, preventing a greater tragedy. That night, after the incident, my mom strengthened the security measures at home, and we became more vigilant, learning how to protect ourselves in emergencies. Although the terrifying experience of that snowy night left a lasting impact on me, it also taught me the importance of family and staying calm and resourceful in the face of danger. It was an ordinary Friday night, and my parents had gone out to attend a friend's party, leaving me alone at home. This was something I was quite used to, and being home alone didn't bother me. My good friend Max was coming over, and we planned to spend the night playing video games, watching movies, and relaxing. I was setting up the gaming console, making sure everything was ready. Max said he'd come over after dinner, but we hadn't set a specific time. Around 8 o'clock, the doorbell rang. I got up from the couch, thinking it was Max. I walked to the front door and opened it, only to see a stranger standing on the porch. This confused me greatly. The man was dressed in dirty, shabby clothes. His beard was unkempt, and his eyes looked tired as they darted around. He started talking to me, asking simple questions, which made me feel nervous. He said he lived nearby, which was strange because I had never seen him before. After a few sentences, I noticed he began to slowly step into the house. By the time I realized what was happening, he was already standing in the doorway, closing the door behind him and then looking at me. I smelled the strong odor of alcohol on his breath. He slowly walked further into the house, looking around. At this point, I started to feel scared, but I tried to stay calm, not wanting to make the situation worse. "Sir, I think you should leave. My friend is coming over soon, and I don't want any trouble." Despite my request for him to leave, the man slowly and carefully pulled something out of his pocket. When he revealed a knife, my heart raced. The room fell silent except for the loud thumping of my heart. He didn't say anything, just motioned for me to go to the kitchen. He made me sit on a chair, moving very quietly. My mind was racing, trying to find a way out. I was torn between wanting to run away and trying to stay safe, knowing that any action I took could have serious consequences. Time seemed to slow down as the man stayed silent, staring at me and making me feel extremely uneasy. I tried to breathe slowly, hoping to calm down. Suddenly, I heard sirens getting closer, growing louder, and I was sure they were coming for me. The police usually didn't come to my neighborhood, but when they rushed into the house, I felt a huge sense of relief. The intruder looked very surprised, his grip on the knife loosened for a moment. The police quickly took advantage, moving in swiftly to disarm and arrest him. Later, I learned that when Max saw the man entering my house from across the street, he was nearby. After witnessing the scene, he immediately went home and told his parents, who called the police, who then came to my rescue. I shudder to think what might have happened if Max had arrived just a few seconds earlier or later. We could have been in serious trouble.